And we are live on a Wednesday evening in central London. Good evening, all. And I've been away or away from the live at least for the last couple of weeks. And I'm excited to be back. And today we are talking about Labour hammering landlords with stricter EPC rules. Now, this is something that we've seen a long time coming. In fact, we knew that the Conservatives had plans and kind of took that away. But we always knew that it was going to come back, whether it was Conservative or whether it was a Labour government. This was something that landlords felt they had dodged the bullet, at least for a few years. And today we're going to break that down as to EPCs, the new rules, or at least the proposals from Labour in recent days, and how that's going to impact landlords, or how it's already impacting the rental market itself, because we have a lag whereby landlords are already anticipating this and were already making adjustments. Let's find out what those adjustments are. But they are, I'm going to tell you right now, spoiler alert, it is a combination of adjustment that includes exiting the market, looking to diversify their portfolio, and let's dive into this. First off, I want to take away. I want to make sure that our audio is doing well on our end, and you can hear us, and also that you can see me properly, and we have no technical issues. Hey, Leslie. Good to see you too, and glad that you're online. I mean, we have another couple of weeks of live streams before we break up for the new year, and I want to try and deliver as much value as I can. It's obviously becoming quite dark and murky, sort of around 4 to 5 p.m. And I want to continue to deliver value for you guys on these live streams. And we will be having some guests coming in as well over the course of the next few weeks as we enter into the new year. So if you're not familiar with our live streams, one thing we always like to do is make it quite interactive. So if you have any questions, feel free to put it through. If you're watching this on a recording, of course, you're probably going to have to put it on a comment, and we'll see if we get back to you. But there will be a recording for this if you just subscribe to the channel and make sure you can get back that recording and the value that we bring here. Okay, great. So again, today we are talking about the Labour government hammering landlords with stricter EPCs. And I want to dive straight into the article from Landlord today. So this article came out, probably 3-4 days ago, and this is from Landlord today. And the government has gone out to formal consultation about stricter EPC performance certificates and perhaps predictably, that means bad news for landlords. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with EPCs, whether you're a landlord or otherwise, it is energy performance certificate. And I'm going to try not to butcher this, but effectively, this is how you can measure how efficient your property is when it comes to heating, electricity, and so forth. Now, typically right now, you would have to do that every 10 years. So an EPC is valid for 10 years and need only to be renewed after that time, unless a rental property changes tenants. However, the government suggests that shorter durations could capture improvements or degradations in energy efficiency between times. So the consultation says that there may be an information benefit for prospective private rental sector tenants and policymakers for more current EPC landlords. EPCs and landlords may be able to capture upgrades to their properties more easily, in turn potentially improving desirability in the market and aiding compliance with regulations such as minimum energy efficiency standards. So then it adds, however, landlords may also incur a very small increase in costs from more regular EPCs. Well, I don't know where that may comes from. I mean, most definitely there will be an increase in cost if you have to, of course, upgrade it or update it every time there is a tenant come in, as opposed to doing it every 10 years. So currently, if you're not familiar, if you have a tenant that's been there for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, there's no need for you to upgrade it, even if that EPC expires. So you only have to update it every 10 years when it expires if you're going to get a new tenant. But let's say, for example, you have an EPC that's valid right now and it's expiring in a couple of years, but then you have a tenant that is staying there after the EPC expires. You don't have to run and get it upgraded. You're good until that tenant leaves, and assuming that you want a new tenant in. At that point, you would have to upgrade it. But there are changes or proposals to the current system. So the new government proposes that new EPC is required at the end of a tenancy duration, even when the same tenant renews or extends their lease. Now, current regulations require an EPC to be commissioned prior to a building being marketed for sale or rent, but allow a maximum of 28 days following the marketing for the certificate to be produced. This is to stop the absence of an EPC hindering a sale or a letting. However, the government now says that there should be an amendment to the regulations to state that the building should not be marketed for sale or let without an EPC. The government says that this will ensure that buyers and renters have the information available to them at the point of making purchasing decision, whilst making the requirements clearer and easier to enforce. The government is also proposing to extend the scope of EPC so that a valid one is required for an entire HMO when a single room within it is rented out. So we're going to go through the actual fine details of this. In the meantime, if you do have a questions, put it through. But we're going to break down the proposals as to what this will mean, whether you have a HMO, whether you have an existing tenant, or a tenant that's changing. And I think the best possible place I can do this, bear with me one moment, let me bring out this article. It's from this here, which is from the property notifier. So let's break this down as to how this could potentially look, at least the proposals. Hopefully you can see my screen still. So here we are. We have EPCs required for every new tenancy. So landlord will need to obtain a new EPC each time they rent a new to a new tenant, replacing the current 10-year-old validity period. This change aims to reflect recent upgrades or improvements in the property energy efficiency. Now, when it comes to HMOs, guys, if you have a HMO or planning to buy a HMO, listen to this. A new EPC would be required for the entire HMO every time a single room is rented out. This closes a loophole in existing regulations where EPCs are only mandated when an entire property is rented. So again, if you are renting out in a HMO a single room, then they are saying that a new EPC would be required for the entire HMO every time that single room is rented out. This closes a loophole in existing regulations. Now, transitions periods for HMO landlords. So landlords of HMOs will have a 24-month transitional period to comply with these requirements. So there is some relief there. Now, if you've just jumped in and I'm talking about all these EPCs and what's happening or the proposals and the potential cost to landlords, one thing to find out is that probably around the next 15-20 minutes, we're also going to go into the market, the housing market, especially how it's impacting landlords right now and as we go into 2025. So just a heads up, just stick with the live video. We're going to be sharing a little bit more as to the impact, not only from an EPC point of view, but this is also a December housing market update. And we do look and review specifically how it's impacting landlords, whether you're looking to sell, buy, or retain your property. It's always interesting to find out. So, continuous EPC validity during tenancy. The government proposes ensuring that tenants in long-term agreements have access to valid and up-to-date EPC throughout their tenancy, not just when the property is marketed. So, to put some context around this, again, once that tenant is in place, at the moment, if the EPC does expire, you don't have any need to upgrade it. With these proposals, you would. And if you're not familiar with the type of work that perhaps you would need to be with the type of works that you will be doing or potentially doing with these type of regulations, these are going to include, but not exclusively, if you had to carry out works, you have insulation improvements. So this could be installing or upgrading insulation to the recommended 270 millimeters, adding cavity wall insulation or solid wall insulation where possible. And of course, this is going to be mostly for those period buildings, because on new builds, I don't see how you're going to make that happen. Upgrading heating systems, so replacing old boilers with energy efficiency condensing boilers, improving windows and doors. I think from my perspective, at least, the experiences that I've seen with landlords has been mostly with improving windows and doors, and of course that can be quite expensive. Energy efficiency lighting, I think this is probably the most economical sort of change that you can do to the property. Adding renewable energy systems, sealing drought proofing, upgrading hot water systems, improving floor insulations, installing ventilation systems, and replacing inefficient appliances, which of course we know can be quite expensive. So again, guys, if you have any questions, please feel free to put it through. I have Stephen. How you doing, Stephen? Property prices have risen despite these challenges. Do you think this trend will continue, or will stricter regulations dampen demand? So when you're talking about demand, I'm going to assume that if you're saying within the context of property prices, is demand from buyers. We will go into that, Stephen, I promise. Just stick with me for the next 15 to 20 minutes, and we're going to look at the housing market, how it's performing now, and how we see it going through to 2025, at least the first half, despite these challenges. How will the proposed stricter EPC regulation impact landlords with older properties that may struggle to meet new standards? Great question, Leslie. And this is probably the segment that is probably the ones that have the most concerns at the moment. It is those older properties, those period buildings, those old school landlords who haven't really, I'll say, refurbished their property, at least not to that level when it comes to upgrading the efficiency of energy. But those are the landlords that perhaps we've seen most of all, where they know it's going to be quite expensive and have decided to sell up. And then we've got Franco. If the landlord, let me share this with you. Apologies, guys. So here are the questions, and I'm going through them slowly but surely. So we have a question by Franco. If the landlord can't afford an EPC upgrade, does that mean that the tenants have to vacate the property? Great question, Franco. So there seems to be some type of support from the government for landlords, but I don't think it's quite enough. Doesn't mean that the tenant will have to pay for it. Absolutely not. Not that I can see, not that I know of. I haven't seen anything to indicate that the tenants by default will end up having to pay for it. Or, I mean, you put here, or vacate the property. I doubt very much that they're going to make a tenant homeless as well, just because the landlord cannot do these upgrades. And it's a very good question, and let me come back to you on that point alone. So, guys, I'm going to go straight into this one here. So this goes to your question, Stephen, as to, I think it was Leslie. Yeah, Leslie, as to how this is impacting, landlords. So hopefully you can actually still see my screen. Yeah. So we've got half of landlords quitting or considering leaving the rental sector. And we're going to dive in as to why that is. And of course, this is going to give us an indication of how many of these are actually due to EPCs. So the barrage of criticism, legislation, and tax burdens aimed at landlords has resulted in almost half. That's half of either actively leaving the rental sector or considering to do so. Now, a new survey by PropTech supplier Good Lord suggests that 30% of landlords have either sold one of their rental properties or put one in the market in the past year. A further 17% of landlords say they're considering reducing their portfolio. Now, this was, I want to give you some more up-to-date stats with regards to this. This was the 4th of October. I want to provide you something a little bit more punchy than that. But here, when asked what's been driving the desire, this is back in October, to leave the market, or at least the article is, to leave the market, reduce the size of the portfolio, 56% are planning to downsize or exit the market, said incoming legislation such as the Renters' Right Bill, in particular, the abolition of Section 21, which of course we know is the so-called no-fault eviction, was a primary reason. Letting agents agree with this. 66% of them say that they believe that the new bill will ultimately lead to fewer rental properties. Now, I'm going to jump straight in here with regards to the EPC. So, opposition to EPC regulations. Now, over half of landlords, that's 52%, also said new rules around energy efficiency standards would be the reason for leaving the sector. And this was back in October. Now, today, in the last few days at least, we have new information of that EPC and what that looks like. I'm sure you'll agree that this 52% has now increased, at least for those landlords who have those old properties and know that that's going to cost them quite a bit to have to upgrade and comply. So almost 1/5 of all landlords whose properties don't meet the minimum threshold said they aren't prepared to invest anything in upgrading their properties. Rising mortgage rates, increased arrears, and tax changes are also driving landlords to sell up. So I hope that this gives you a little bit more insight as to what's happening with the EPC and landlord sentiment, at least, with regards to these proposals coming through. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them through. But one thing I did want to point out, as we are in the topic of landlords exiting the market, this isn't purely based on EPC, but this is a good data to share. And stay online because there is good news for landlords that do decide to stay on the market. It's not just all grim and bad news. There is an upside to those property investors who are staying in the market, are adjusting, and are kind of, riding out the wave. When I say riding out the wave, I say more so from a mortgage point of view, because there are a lot of legislations and a lot of regulations coming in that landlords are concerned. And to be quite honest with you, I think when you look at it a little bit closer, there is a lot of scaremongering out there. I'm just going to say that and leave it at that. Of course, when it comes to the EPCs, it is something that's best that you kind of look at and start making calculations, pen to paper, and on that basis, it is sensible to make a decision of whether you do want to exit the market. But with regards to the legislations and regulations, I wouldn't pay that much attention to it. It's about educating yourself, understanding what's happening. But this is something that I did want to share with you. Over the next 12 months, 41% of landlords say they plan to sell at least some rental properties. Now, this is comparison to 19% of landlords who actually decided to sell the property in the previous 12 months. But 41% decided to actually they will sell some of their rental properties. Now, there is a clue here, guys, some of their rental properties. So it's not that 40% of landlords are exiting the market. It's 40% of landlords are decided to sell some of their properties. And this could be professional landlords restructuring, readjusting, just making sure that they're getting rid of those properties that are simply not giving them the return or perhaps not in the structure that is going to be the most viable for them. Yes, we're seeing casual landlords, and casual landlords being those landlords who have a couple of properties leaving the market because it just simply doesn't make sense to them. All the scaremongering from the media is just far too much for them, or they just simply don't want to be a landlord anymore because it doesn't make sense for them. They don't have the time, and yet at the same time, with regards to them actually being a landlord in the first place, it wasn't something they actually decided to do. They even inherited the property. Divorce, there is a lot of properties that are, a lot of people who accidentally became a landlord from a divorce, stayed with the property, moved elsewhere, and so forth. So I hope that this is being helpful. Again, we're going to be jumping into the housing market as we come towards the end of the year and how that's impacting overall buyers and sellers. But specifically, we're also going to be looking at how it affects and impacts landlords. Okay, great. So, what we have here is, are there any financial incentives or government grants available to help landlords make their properties more energy efficient? At the moment, I see no incentives, at least any new incentives. There are some out there, they're quite dated, but we will look out for any new ones. If a landlord can't afford the EPC, he shouldn't be a landlord. Well, I don't know. It will be interesting to find out other people's comments on this. Because more monkey business, I guess there are different things and different ways you can look at this. I agree with you to an extent, but then if a landlord hasn't taken into consideration, for example, they have to change windows, which can go into tens of thousands of pounds, change boilers, insulate the property, you're talking about a lot of money. And most landlords that I know don't have tens of thousands of pounds to invest. But I agree, if it's changing a boiler, which probably be, I don't know, 4 grand thereabouts, and they don't have that type of money, then I agree with you to an extent. But that's why it's so important for landlords to educate yourselves in terms of the cost before you even become a buy-to-let investor, because property has its ups, but it also has its downsides, and it's important that you review that. By the way, guys, if you wanted to book in an appointment just to sort of discuss the properties or property that you have and whether it's worthwhile keeping that, we do provide a free consultation. Just feel free just to pencil that in. I'm always interested to find out what landlords are doing at the moment. We have another one here. Are there any specific property types or locations that might be more resilient to these regulatory changes? I guess the best answer to that, Andrew, is going to be new builds. I'm not a big fan of new builds. I think it does make sense in certain locations at certain price points, and especially in rental demand. You have to look at it very carefully. But there are some new builds that make sense, and I think that, in my opinion, this is probably the best way that you can mitigate that. I have someone here asking, would this still affect short-term rentals? No, not that I know of. I could be wrong with that, but I'm pretty sure this is based for long-term rental properties. So could this be another push to landlords to move into the short-term rental sector? I think so. But then let's not forget that, and the government is working away to get some regulation even on those short-term rentals. So that's going to be interesting to see. So we have another question here before we move on from EPCs. How will the requirement for valid EPC before marketing a property affect the speed of letting out a property? Well, based on what the government is proposing, it will affect it greatly, because if you don't have an EPC, you can't market the property. So, you either comply and do what you need to do. My advice to most people out there is make sure you jump on a call, or you jump with an agent to come into the property and look at what your EPC rating is and give some advice as to what potential upgrades you need. Now, of course, an agent isn't necessarily a builder or an EPC inspector, but being out in and out of properties, they have a pretty good guide and idea as to what you will need to do based on your current EPC. So my best advice, if you take anything away from this live stream today, is plan ahead. Regardless of whether it's law now, if it's the legislation's come through just yet, regardless of that, it's going to come through at some point. It's the same thing with the Renters' Rights Bill. It's going to come through at some point. Get ahead of this. Look at what the cost is going to be. If it's much more than you like to bear, then, look at how you can make those numbers work and keep the property should you wish to. If not, then sell the property. because it's going to come at some point. I hope that is helpful. So again, guys, if you're just jumping in, what we have reviewed right now is looking at the um, EPC regulations, how landlords are reacting to that. And here is another one. Many landlords to hike rents to pay for EPC improvements. So this isn't something that just impact landlords, guys. So those landlords who are decided to stay and saying, you know what, I'm not going to be bullied, and I'm not going to be pushed out the market because of this EPC. I'll make it work. But then how do they make it work? Well, here you are. Here's an answer. And again, it's cause and effect, whether it's the Labour government or whether it's the Conservative sort of interfering with market dynamics. There's always going to be an impact, cause and effect. So hike 2 rents to pay for EPC improvements. So here we have a mortgage lender survey reveals that over 2/3 of private landlords currently own at least one property that does not meet the new EPC target. Foundation Home Loans research found that awareness of these EPC standards is high, with 92% of landlords having at least some awareness of the requirements, but only 67% reporting a thorough understanding. So portfolio landlords with 4 or more buy-to-let mortgages demonstrate slightly lower knowledge, with 62% stating they fully understand the requirements compared to 69% of unencumbered and consumer borrowers. Let me repeat that. Portfolio landlords with 4 or more buy-to-let mortgages demonstrate slightly lower knowledge, with 62% stating they fully understand the requirements. So some 42% of landlords intend to make the necessary improvements to bring their impacted properties up to standard. Again, a lot of landlords being quite resilient, quite resourceful, and saying, we'll make this work. Meanwhile, 24% plan to carry out works at the minimum costs required to comply and continue to let their property out. And another 14% aim to carry out the works that maximize the long-term value of property and continue to let out. Some 3%, this is 3%, will carry out works to bring their property up to standard, then sell it. However, 34% plan to sell without undertaking any work or not let the property. 17% respondents other, and 3% don't plan to carry out any works but continue letting out the property. So I'll be very worried about this 3%. I feel that this 3% is kind of burying your head in the sand and hoping for the best. I don't want to know about it. I'm not going to carry out any works. I'm going to continue letting the property and hope for the best. When suddenly what they get is having to do it, it happens slowly and then suddenly. And then once they find out how much the cost is going to be, with 15, 20 grand, they don't have that money. And that's where you start seeing landlords putting themselves in quite a pickle. So for those who plan to carry out the necessary work, 17% expect to use their savings, 41% via rent increases, and 28% through grants. Now, I'm going to say something based on the comment from Frank. Now, Frank here put a comment, Franco, apologies. If a landlord can't afford an EPC upgrade, does that mean that the tenants have to? Okay, no, this wasn't it. Someone put a comment that if they don't have the money to do these upgrades, they shouldn't. It was money monkey business, more monkey business. They shouldn't be a landlord. One thing I will say to this is that if a landlord isn't putting money aside every year, every month for these type of things, slowly but surely, for things that creep up, then I agree you shouldn't be a landlord, because you're not treating this as a business. You're treating this as a business, then you're the type of landlord that are going to find yourself in trouble. So just wanted to share that. And there's a few more questions which I'll get to. So for those who are planning to carry out the necessary work, 70% are taken from their savings. And I hope that when they say savings, I hope that they mean sort of money they've put aside from the rental property 41% via rent increases, and 28% through grants. A further 12% saying they would release equity from their portfolio, and 5% seeking a further advance from a mortgage lender, or 5% from a loan. So the lender undertook 720 online interviews in September and October, and the spokesperson says, with potential new legislation aiming to raise energy efficiency standards and tackle fuel poverty for millions, landlords face important decisions around future-proofing their investment from an EPC perspective. Thankfully, this research helps demonstrate the growing awareness among landlords around this topic and highlights both the financial planning consideration involved in meeting these requirements. And again, this is the biggest takeaway. It is about financial the financial and planning considerations. So it also underlines a tremendous potential for lenders and intermediaries to support sustainable practices in the buy-to-let sector, particularly through tailored green mortgage products. So there you are, guys. I was going to point out something along the lines of what was it? I've lost my trail of thought. But I hope this has been this is helpful in giving you a little bit more perspective with the EPC regulations. And if you have any further questions, do let me know if you're watching this on recorded. In the meantime, here are some questions that may answer for you. So are there specific property types or location? Okay, we've talked about this already. We've got Edmund. How will requirements for valid EPC before marketing property affect the speeds? We went through that. What advice would you have for a landlord who are considering exiting the market due to these tighter compliance rules? I would say just make sure that you've considered all avenues. So I think what I've shared with you so far with regards to different landlords reviewing different ways to mitigate these costs, and as long as if you review these and you do have an appetite and staying in the market, then that's something that you just that you should be doing. Make sure that you look at all the options before you make a hasty decision. We've got Martin Pierce. Will these stricter regulations apply differently to HMOs compared to single let properties? Yeah, if you've missed that, Martin Pierce, yes, there are different well, at least the proposals do tend to be different, especially when we looked at this article here with HMOs, and HMOs will also have a transition period, if this is approved, of 24 months in comparison to your regular EPCs for long-term rental properties. And then you have, if you did want to change, update the single rooms and rent out a single room, then you will have to do it for the entire building as well. So yeah, there are some differences there. I hope that helps. So next up, we have Stephen James. Definitely, Danny, it is, but I will appreciate if you can help me with what steps should landlords take, how to prepare for these proposed changes, and so forth. Well, listen, to be helpful with you, to you, I think this is possibly the best sort of recommendations I can make for you. And this is how landlords are expecting to, those landlords who decide to stay, how they're expecting to mitigate this. So 17% expect to use their savings. Again, hopefully that is savings that you're making from the same rental property that you put aside every month or every year. 41% via rent increases, and 28% through grants. And a further 12% saying that they will release equity from their portfolio, and 5% seeking a further advance from a mortgage lender. So that is what you should be doing, as well as looking, before you do this, getting the quotes that you need to get from contractors to be able to upgrade your property. Once you have that, then you can take the steps to see how you can finance that cost. I hope that that is helpful for you, Stephen. That's the best advice I can possibly give you. I remember what I was going to share, which was that there's a big percentage of landlords, as we've seen from this article, that are planning to increase the rent to be able to mitigate some of these costs. And that is not the only reason landlords are going to be increasing the rent. I see rent increasing to a good percentage at some point in the future, especially next year. And there's going to be several reasons for this. And rent growth, if you're not aware, has slowed down substantially in comparison to the craziness that we've seen over the course of the last 3 years. I mean, over 30% in some areas of the country, and it has slowed down. But I believe that it's going to increase, it's going to grab momentum again next year. And there are two specific reasons for this, or three. Number one, if this trend of landlords exiting the market continues, because that means that there's going to be more demand, because I don't see the demand for rental decreasing. But there is going to be less supply. So number one. Number two, the renters' rights bill is going to come in with abolishing, doing away with bidding wars for renters. So what you can't do anymore is you can't put the rental property up on the market for £3,000 per month, as an example, have a lot of demand and end up at £3,500. That's going to be something of the past. It's history. They're going to do away with it. Therefore, what I anticipate landlords doing is they don't want to leave money on the table. So if they think their property is worth £3,000, but they think that they can potentially get more, but don't want to put it for £3,000 because, again, that's going to be illegal, then they're going to put it for £3,500 and negotiate downwards if necessary. And a lot of landlords are going to be in that same position. So rentals are going to get increase on that front. And then you got the third point, which is what we just seen. A big percentage of landlords are deciding to mitigate the cost of EPCs by increasing the rent. And those are just three that I'm sharing. I'm sure there are much more, but I see that being the three major reasons a lot of rent is going to increase in the future. So, Danny, how might short-term let be impacted by the tighter compliance rules? And what should landlords consider to stay compliant? I don't believe that it will be impacted. Short-term rentals, these regulations are very much for long-term rentals and for those tenants, protecting those tenants, not for protecting guests for short-term rentals. So, if anything, I think it will push a lot of landlords into short-term rentals. That's my thoughts. But look out, be wary. You have been warned. Short-term rental regulations is coming our way also. So look out for that. More monkey business. A landlord needs to save 20k cash flow just in case the tenant stop paying and the rent if he has a mortgage on the property, and it can take up to 12 months to get the property out. I think that's sensible. Advice. More monkey business. I would just add one thing to that. It also depends on what part of the country you're in, because if you're further north with properties that clearly mortgage is going to be much less and rent is going to be much less, then I would probably put a caveat on that. So listen, guys, we have covered a lot with EPC, and I think we have provided a lot of advice, if I may say so myself. I wanted to look a little bit into the housing market and how that's impacting landlords at the moment, because I said to you that there is a silver lining in all of this. I don't want to be the bearer of bad news here and not provide any good news. So for you landlords sort of scratching your head and thinking, well, all of this stuff, why would I decide to stay? Well, rental demand is still right up there. Okay, rental demand continues to go strong. That's one of the reasons a lot of landlords are staying and making the numbers work. Number one. Okay, number two, there is capital growth in the horizon, and this is something that I wanted to share with you. Let's jump into the forecast of Savills. If you're not familiar, you may know, and let me share with you. In 2024, a lot of the experts had predicted a negative number in terms of capital growth. And property has been incredibly resilient, guys. I mean, if we look at, apologies, but I'm going to go into a little bit of a rant here. If we look at over the course of the last 10 years and we take into account Brexit, or even before Brexit, the lead up to Brexit, okay, leaving Europe, this was something big. And we look at Brexit actually being executed. And then we see the COVID era coming in, and then the turmoil of Liz Truss and the political turmoil that we've seen throughout the last few years, a recession. And, the list goes on and on with the Renters Reform Bill, as previously known by the Conservatives, and now the Renters' Rights Bill and everything else. And property, we haven't had a property price crash. We've had a transaction crash. That's fair. Yet we haven't seen a property crash. Now, of course, for you guys out there and taking into consideration inflation, so in real terms, absolutely, there has been, in fact, a price crash. But if you look at property prices now in comparison to what they were 10 years ago, there hasn't been much movement. But what we have seen is an increase this year. And it was predicted that it was going to be a decrease. We've seen an increase, I'll say probably of average of around about, so far at least, of around about 2 to 3%. I'll say probably closer to 3%. Now, it's not a percentage or a number that's going to get you jumping for excitement, but certainly given all the turmoil that we've seen, and we've seen those numbers, I think that we have cautious optimism going ahead. At least that is what I'm hearing from those landlords who are staying in the market, buyers and sellers. But let's look at the forecast from Savills moving forward in the next 5 years. So, summary. So, for mainstream UK house price, we're seeing a 4% in 2025. So, if we look at the average of this year, we're going to fall around that 3.5%. They're estimating to be another 4%. And then you see 2026, 2027, a total of 23% over the course of the next 5 years. Housing transactions, I think this is a lead indicator, of course, and I think housing transaction is a good number to track. And if we look at that, we're seeing around about close on average 1.1 or 1.2. Looking at this 1.1 average million. And then you've got mainstream UK rental, we're seeing an average of the next 5 years of 17%, 4% for 2025, 26, 3.5%, and then sort of round about the 3% mark they're on. I'm going to be bold and say that I anticipate 2025 and 2026 being higher than this because of all the reasons that I've given. There definitely is not going to be continued growth at the speed that we've seen in the last 36 months. And this is a good thing, by the way, guys. It's not sustainable for it to grow at that level, be it for landlords, tenants, or any stakeholder within the rental market, because this is where you start seeing that political interference and you see politicians sort of pushing and pushing more. I mean, as we know, if Sadiq Khan here in London had it his way, he will have a rental control that would be absolutely disastrous for renters, by the way, not only for landlords, but for renters, because we've seen this again and again. By the way, if you haven't seen the rent control videos that we've done, make sure you subscribe and you look through the playlist of London specifically, and you can see the stats of what happens when governments across different countries start to interfere at that level. So luckily, Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, hasn't been given those powers, but what he is doing, and I take my hat off him to him if he can achieve that, because I do believe that there is a lot of demand for social housing and also just affordable housing, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I believe that is something that should be tackled, and that's not going to be resolved with private landlords. That is the government's responsibility. And I'd love to see more of that. The government sort of looking at that side of things. But the housing crisis is due to a lack of housing, not because landlords aren't doing what the government is asking them to do. Not the landlord's responsibility at all. So I don't know if there are other questions, but for now, feel free to send in your question with regards to the housing market. But just to finish this off with Savills, they are seeing something close to 17% annual rental increase over the course of 5 years. I'm confident that that's going to be probably above 20%. So we are focusing UK strongest performing region are expected to be the north of England and Scotland. We are forecasting 5-year growth of almost 30% for the northwest, and strongest region, London, is expected to continue to be the weakest growing region, and it is most constrained by affordability. But we have increased a 5-year figure from 14 to 17%. There you are. Okay. So my next one is going to be based on, let's have a look here. Zoopla's takeaways for October. So if we look at, this is probably the wrong one. Let's look at HomeLet in terms of rental and how it's performed over the course of the last month in comparison also to previous years. And this is looking at the rent specifically. Hopefully you can see my screen, and we've got HomeLet here. We see for November, the data shows that the average rental price for a new tenancy, the UK was £1,300. And it's actually, if you look at the north, it wasn't probably 2-3 years ago, it was rare to see rental properties on average being more than £1,000. That was quite rare. Now it's becoming the norm. So UK average, excluding London, £1,100. London average is £2,150. Cheapest rent is £600. Not sure where that's going to be. And then you've got largest MOM decrease. 9 regions in the UK saw a price decrease. However, Scotland 3% monthly, whatever that means. I've got this Zoopla one, which I do want to share because I find Zoopla's stats quite interesting and informative. So here you are. Housing market returns to growth 2024, supported by rising incomes and lower mortgage rates. And I know we have a lot of people online say lower mortgage rates, they're still very high. Yes, they are, but they are certainly lower than what we saw 12 to 18 months ago. And we need to look at this from a new era, which is we're not going to see those 2% mortgage rates that we saw prior to 2022. That is a thing from the past. When will we be able to see that type of mortgage rates? I'm not sure. If that's something that you're waiting for, you may be waiting for a long time. And perhaps we're not also going to see lower mortgage rates that we anticipate in 2025. And you can thank your Labour government for that with the most recent budget, which may push unemployment higher. And if that happens, then what we are going to see is inflation not running steady, and the Bank of England sort of taking the measures to balance that out. Whether that's going to happen, we don't know. What we do know is the first half of 2025 probably is going to be a little bit more stable, and we need to wait to see what's going to happen in the second half. I did have someone ask me, several people ask me, if there is going to be a price crash when it comes to property in 2025. I have not seen any indication whatsoever to indicate that there's going to be a price crash for 2025. None whatsoever. I was stuck in a room with hundreds of agents just a couple of weeks ago with professional investors and landlords. And, landlords and investors, and especially agents, they're not the most optimistic. They like to be quite realistic, quite pragmatic. And we're not seeing the data. Data doesn't say that. If you're seeing data that suggests otherwise, please do correct me, send it across, and I'll be happy to review any data that suggests anything about a price crash in 2025. What we're seeing is momentum right now. Of course, because of the stamp duty increase that is going to be triggered in April, we do have somewhat of an artificial market right now. Yet what we are seeing is the biggest segment of buyers right now is first-time buyers, and that's not going to continue. That's not going to slow down. Those first-time buyers are going to continue to be the ones being the biggest segment in the market for 2025. Granted that the buy-to-let investors, number one, and overall cash buyers are going to be the lower end of that and impacted as we go into 2025. So I hope that's helpful. And going back into our Zoopla stats, and if you're just joining, just a heads up, we've gone through the EPCs impact in the country and how it's going to continue to impact in 2025. And most importantly, how landlords are reacting and adjusting to this proposal brought in that is going to, of course, be quite expensive. And those landlords who are decided to stay in the market, what adjustments or how they're looking to be able to finance that. So if you're watching this and you just come on, it is recorded. Just make sure you go through and review that data. So all regions in the country recorded positive year-on-year growth, with the average at 1.5% up to 1.2% a year ago. Housing market has now largely adjusted to higher borrowing costs. So again, I always say when the market shifts, be it because of mortgage rates, be it because political turmoil, whatever it may be it because of COVID or Brexit, what happens is there is this lag time between what buyers believe is fair market value and sellers as well. So, for example, when COVID hit and there was this race for space, property prices went through the roof, but then it slowed down. And there was a period where sellers thought that they could still get away with inflated prices. And it just wasn't happening. So it took a bit of time for those sellers to kind of adjust, be a little bit realistic, and find what that fair market price was. Housing market. So UK house prices are projected to rise by 2.5% in 2025, with a 5% increase in the volume of housing transactions predicted at 1.15 million. So I think Zoopla is being a little bit more conservative in terms of increase in price for 2025. We've seen Savills be it around about 4%. And I believe all the others of Halifax and Nationwide also are closer to around about 3% to 4%. We'll review that together. So more buyers will pay higher stamp duty in England and Northern Ireland, which will act as a drag on price inflation. Mortgage rates are unlikely to change over the 2025, but we expect lenders to innovate affordability assessment to support demand. And again, a large part of this, because prior to the budget, largely, at least most of us did anticipate those mortgage rates or the Bank of England base rate to come down much quicker. But of course, they are being cautious, understandably, after the budget. So we have the nationwide stats here, which I'll go through. And I have a question here for a few people. So I'm just going to answer these before I go into nationwide stats and how they compare with Zoopla and how they compare with Savills. So could the increased cost of meeting EPC requirements drive more landlords out of the market? And what does that mean for tenants? So yeah, the answer is yes, wise process. I would say look back sort of 20 minutes into this recording, and EPC costs will have an impact on rent and on tenants' supply of properties, together with EPC, together with the regulation, the mortgage rates, and so much else. This is just another layer of landlords exiting the market, but there is a silver lining for those landlords who decide to stay, and we've gone through them which is, of course, the continued demand and rental increase ongoing and capital growth. So how do these proposed changes compare to current EPC requirements, and what is the timeline for implementation? Well, those proposals are still to be approved. So until then, I can't give you any further information on this. The best thing I can say is subscribe to the channel, so when those timelines are given, we can update you accordingly. Stephen J, for landlords managing portfolios, what challenges might arise from managing EPC compliance across? Let me come back to you as I go through the property prices that we're seeing in the housing market, because that is the momentum we have at the moment. So annual house price growth rebounds November. So UK, we're comparing this with Zoopla and Savills. So we've seen that Savills are predicting a 4% annual growth for 2025. Zoopla more conservative at 2.5%. As we go through here nationwide, we're saying that house prices rose 1.2% month on month. Annual growth rate rebounded to 3.7% from 22.4% in October, fastest since November. House prices now just 1% below all-time peak. So here are headlines. Monthly index change, annual change. So annual change, 2.4% in October, 3.7% in November. Average price, so here you are. Do we have a forecast for 2025? It doesn't seem that Nationwide is giving us this. Housing market activity has remained relatively resilient. What do we have here? Temporary increase in rate stamp duty thresholds will expire 31st of March and revert to their previous level. For first-time buyers purchasing property under 500,000, the nil rate band threshold will fall to 300,000 from 425 at present, while the other residential buyers nil rate. Okay, this information that we've already seen. If you want to dive in about stamp duty, you can do so. But it would have been good to have seen that nationwide prediction, but we haven't seen that. But listen, guys, we've run through a lot today, including the impact of EPCs to landlords and how they're making those adjustments. Most importantly, how they're planning to finance for those works if needed. We've also looked at the housing market, rentals, what they are right now, the prediction as we go into 2025. I think it's been a good live. Thank you as ever for participating in this. Have a look at the description for any links with regards to booking an appointment to keep you up to date. I absolutely love jumping on calls and finding out landlords and investors' experiences, and always great to find out. Also, if you want to keep up to date with property market updates, we do have a newsletter that goes out every Friday. It is sometimes funny, sometimes witty, sometimes grim, but I'm sure that if you sign up to it, you'll enjoy it, as most of our investors, buy-to-let investors, do. So thank you very much, guys. Appreciate your time. Have a good evening. And now just ending the stream.